Okay, so everybody, welcome to the panel GINN Deep Dive, Taxation and Market Surveillance in the EU and Beyond. My name is Ciprian Boboi, and a few words about me. I have 15 years in the industry, from different roles entrepreneur up to my last roles for the past 7 years as the co-founder and board executive of independent European Vape Alliance. Moving forward, I would like to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves shortly, and then we'll go further with the questions.
Hello, I am Tomasz Płaska from Novel and we at Novel we are a manufacturer of raw materials, nicotine raw materials, including pure nicotine, nicotine salts, and other forms of nicotine, as well as retail products such as liquids and nicotine pouches.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leonhard Kipphan. I'm representing Sapiens. Sapiens is a software company based in Germany, and we are doing, we're supporting the industry with track and trace regulation, which is for the time being mostly tobacco, but it's expected that the nicotine pouch and the vape industries will be affected by it very soon as well, so we're supporting those industry segments going forward as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Lorenzo Guaragna from Tomasz Intelligence. I'm head of legal analysis, and you may know we're a data company providing regulatory and market data for NGPs, so any product that is alternative to tobacco basically.
Thank you. I will start with a broad framing question for all of you. If we take a step back, are current EU taxation and surveillance frameworks for alternative products evolving in the correct direction? Or are we building a patchwork that risks undermining both public health and market stability?
So, well, we all know there's a proposal for TTD presented last year in July 2025, if I'm not wrong. And of course, it's trying to harmonize the sector, introducing a minimum duty for novel products. But the problem is that products are on the market already for several years, so we're already seeing patchy regulation with some countries embracing harm reduction, while some other just taxing them as other tobacco products, as other existing category. And also we gotta remember that in fiscal policies, member states can go higher than the minimum rate introduced by the next TTD. So that's just gonna be an issue as well for the EU market, in my opinion.
Yeah, in general, we see that there is existing unified, let's say, regulation for tobacco products. The same does not exist for the novel products. And we know that the European Union is working on closing that gap. How well they will achieve on doing that, we don't know yet. We hope that they will take an approach and to kind of help to kind of curb the very different approaches that the member states are taking with regards to allowing certain things and not allowing other things. But it remains to be seen to what extent the new TPD that we expect, TPD Wave 3 that we expect this year, will accomplish that objective. I think there's reason to be somewhat concerned that they will not fully manage, but at least a European approach that is sort of unified in certain areas, such as track and trace, the area where my expertise is something that I think is overall a good thing. But there's other areas where I'm sure there's concerns and there's challenges that we still have to solve.
I would say that regardless of how the new TPD will be introduced, when we take a look on how TPD is currently implemented in countries, I would rather say that we have a patchwork, and the scope of implementation in different countries vary, and it's different. And I would say that the differences maybe themselves are not so bad, but the biggest problem is the scope of the differences, the pace of changes, and the, let's say, adaptation costs for the companies these are the most important things in terms of differences between the countries. Differences themselves are not so bad, but the scope of differences and the cost of the adaptations for the companies that operate internationally, this is the biggest problem from the company's perspective.
Lorenzo, looking at the taxation logic and risk alignment, from a legal and policy standpoint, do you see any real movements towards risk proportional taxation, or are we still largely anchored in the legacy of tobacco logic?
Well, at the European level, we're not really seeing this approach of harm reduction. If you just read the proposal of the next TTD, we can see the rates are still quite linked to traditional tobacco products. But there's an interesting opinion from the European Economic Social Committee from February this year that is basically telling the Commission, look, you should tax less if the harm is less compared to the other products. So that is very interesting that there's an European body calling for that, but the European Commission doesn't really seem that as viable. So we're already seeing this, as my colleague here saying, that patchy regulation. You know, there are some countries that are embracing harm reduction, and I don't know, I can think of Italy, for example, that have reduced rates for heated tobacco compared to combustible cigarettes, but still those rates are calculated on the combustible cigarettes rates, you know, so we should try to avoid this kind of comparison and link and just treat the product differently, recognize their different nature, and I'm sure in the European Council this will come up at a certain point, and this is gonna also be a turning point in the negotiation, definitely. Yeah.
I was about to ask that, as our policy makers generally trying to differentiation mostly rhetoric at this stage, but I think you already replied.
Yeah, it's mostly rhetorical. Because I was saying before, the products are seen as tobacco products sometimes, so there's not really a differentiation in that. For example, another example is that I'm thinking now is Sweden with heated tobacco as well. That they didn't even create a separate category. They're just applying like other smoking tobacco products, excise rate to heated tobacco products. So they're not even recognize a different technology, different product, different type of, you know, smoking and usage.
So I guess we can agree one of the worrying thing is that the whole categories are approached as the nicotine, and I guess the message out there is nicotine is bad. So.
Yeah, and as you also can see from the evaluation report of the TPD2 that was published a couple of weeks ago, that's basically the position of the Commission at the moment. But I'm sure that member states will definitely challenge that in the European Council for the TTD, but most importantly for the TPD in the European Parliament. That's going to be a heated debate with a lot of amendments. I'm sure we're going to have so much work to keep up on that.
The following years will be will be pretty tough. Anybody who wants to add something on? I will move Tomasz, from an industry perspective. How the current taxation structures influence product development and marketing position, and also are companies adapting products to regulation, or regulations are adapting to products?
Okay, so I would say that the influence of the taxes of on the product development works in a way that the way that taxes are developed, let's say, they create some kind of framework within which we as companies have to work with in terms of product development. And that means that this influence is really big, and we have to fit into this frame that is developed by the regulators, and that determines the volume of the products, the strength, etc. And that also means that. But this is the role of the taxes, to influence the customer's behavior. So it is natural that they work that way, that they have a significant impact on how the products occur on the market. And that, of course, means that they are not always designed in a way that the customers would expect them, but rather some products might be commercially more reasonable because of the taxes, not because of the demand from the market. And that, of course, that shapes the product development, but also that positions the products in a different way because of the way that it works that way.
Thank you. Lorenzo, do you see the upcoming revision as moving toward a minimum standard or towards a deeper harmonization?
So yeah, of course the ultimate goal of the Commission is harmonization, but as I mentioned before, fiscal matters, the member state has sovereignty over that, so they are definitely trying to introduce minimum rates, to bring in the tobacco category these novel nicotine products, but it's gonna be impossible to have equally taxed nicotine products in all member states because yeah, we're gonna have a minimum rate, but then I'm sure countries will go way higher, other will just apply the minimum rate. So that's the real issue, like harmonization is not real in fiscal matters. What the European Commission can do is just introduce minimum rates, and then from there the member states can build up. So I would just say they're going in a way of introduction, a minimum excise rate, and that's it. Harmonization, in my opinion, is quite impossible.
Would you say that the harmonization will require also to set up a maximum level?
I don't think it's something the European Commission is allowed to do. So we will see disparities that we're seeing in factory-made cigarettes, for example. We have big gaps in, if you just think, neighboring country like Italy and Spain versus France, where prices in France are almost double, and it's very likely that this is what's going to happen also for novel nicotine products, in my opinion.
We know that in the actual context, we have just national taxation. There are a lot of B2C, almost we can call it illicit from countries, sales B2C, sales from countries with low taxation, as France to Italy maybe has a higher taxation. So do you believe this will remain in the future? In the future TPD, you will have these big gaps, although it's at a minimum level, it has a harmonization, but do you see big gaps between taxation from countries to countries?
Yeah, definitely, because we are seeing lately also a shift of member states to abandoning this harm reduction approach. Like if we think right now, there are just a few countries that are really approaching the products this way. Some other countries, they're just linking their taxation to the combustibles product, and then from there they're like, oh yeah, maybe I'm applying a discount, or no, I'll just apply this category to novel nicotine products. So yeah, definitely we're gonna see disparities, and also the problem of cross-border trade and loss of revenues, for example.
I know for a fact countries, there are already 21 countries having a local excise, and many of them are suffering because of the cross-border sales from countries without. So eventually, I think this harmonization won't solve, or at least totally the issue.
Yeah, definitely. That's gonna be an issue even with this harmonization by the European Commission, because basically member states can do whatever they want starting from that minimum, and yeah, also there's the risk of high taxes that bring in illicit market or illegal cross-border trades.
Thank you. Tomasz, licensing schemes are expanding across many EU markets. Are we reaching a point where compliance complexity becomes a barrier to entry, especially for smaller players?
I would say that despite of the mechanism, the specific mechanism, the complexity is the complexity for compliance is growing, and that of course means that the entrance barriers on the market are also growing, and they are already quite high. But what I would like to also say that this complexity means the higher operational costs for the companies. And that means that from the perspective of the smaller companies, if they are with growing complexity of regulations, it means that smaller companies simply will not be profitable anymore, some of them. So there is a high pressure for scaling of the companies, and that means also operating internationally, and that also means adapting to different regulations across different countries. That also takes costs. And now when we have TPD already, the TPD might change quite soon. And we have ongoing discussion on the excise tax across Europe. So that adds additional layers, let's say, of complexity for the companies, and it makes the transitional costs of adaptation for the companies much higher. It takes time and focus of the companies to adapt. It changes the market as well, so there is another challenge for the companies. So from the perspective of small companies that operate on a smaller scale and the lowering margin because of these changes, the situation might be very challenging, and for sure some of them should consider, let's say, different scenarios that might happen and understand if there is some chance for them to be able to find themselves, let's say in specific scenarios. And for sure some of them should change their business model, and many companies already did it in the past changes. And now with the changes that will probably take place, probably it might be even more challenging than it was in the past. So the model, the changing the business model that we have seen already is in UK, for example, there are many companies like that, and in Poland as well, that used to be small manufacturers, or even not very small, even medium manufacturers. And they changed their business model into distributors. They started to focus more on sales and marketing, and they outsourced the production to, some of them outsourced it to EU countries and some to China. And I think that when we talk about the upcoming changes, we and regulators should also take into account the economical impact of these changes, and think if this is really the impact that we desire to outsource the activity of or part of activity of companies from the country or even from the EU.
I believe I have 15 years in the industry, and I would say that one of the most important aspect of a company is the adaptability. Okay, we've been through a lot of unpredictable times, unexpected shifts in regulations, taxes, and so on. And I think we all agree that moving forward in the next years, adaptability is again might be more important than before. Leonhard, we often hear that the track and trace systems are the backbone of the illicit trade control. In practice, how effective are current systems in dealing with the next generation products, which most probably under the TED is not clear, but under the TED we'll have the track and trace imposed as well.
Yes. Yeah, very good question, and very difficult to answer question. So I think in general the track and trace systems, they provide sort of the backbone to enable a unified system that allows authorities to enforce regulation, right? So this is the reason they want to do it. But of course they have one let's say error by design, because they do not include companies that are not willing to, or they're not interested in a legal business to begin with, right? So these companies will not invest in track and trace, and these companies will not be interested in participating in the legal market, right? So track and trace systems alone will not solve any issue with regards to illicit trade and smuggling and these kind of things. So it needs to be together with a proper enforcement by the European Union to do it, because otherwise legal products will not have any benefit, right? They will bear all the costs and they will not have any benefit from implementing track and trace. So in a way you can say that track and trace makes sense, right? But it needs to be accompanied by the enforcement mechanism to make sure that the European Union creates a benefit or a good environment for legal companies to thrive in. And if that's not happening, then track and trace has no benefit at the end of the day.
If I'm not wrong, track and trace was implemented for tobacco cigarettes something like 8, maybe 9, 10 years ago.
12.
12 years. Were you around that time? Do you
Yes.
have any? Can you share with us what were the main challenges of these companies to adapt the track and trace in terms of, I don't know, I know there are some costs behind, I know there are some time.
Well, in the beginning, of course, it was extreme. It was a very big learning curve for everybody involved, right? Because when track and trace came around, so that the TPD was implemented or was announced in 2014, right? So the companies had 5 years to prepare, and the way it usually goes, even if you have 5 years, you really start dealing with the details only maybe 2 years ago, 2 years before it becomes the law, or 1 year. And so there was, of course, a lot of pressure from every stakeholder in the industry to implement it in time. And even, you know, the solutions that are in place today and that are quite matured now, they have not been mature at the time, right? So there was a lot of trial and error in the beginning. And one of the things that Europe did well in that instance is that they started with the big companies, right? They started with the tobacco companies that were producing the cigarettes and the roll-your-own tobacco, and they gave them 5 years, or they gave basically the industry 5 years to have a learning curve and understand how track and trace works. And then only 5 years later, the OTP was included, which was 2024, so 2 years ago now. And I think that was much smoother, even though the industry segment is much more diverse, right? There's much more different kinds of manufacturing processes, smaller and larger companies, manual processes involved, smaller distributors compared to the tobacco industry. And to reference something that you said before, we have experience, of course, that even though we had this learning curve and there was 5 years of learning on how to deal with track and trace, there was a consolidation happening, and some of the smaller companies, especially companies that were very traditional, like let's say cigar companies that had a long history but were not very technologically advanced, they were really struggling with implementing the processes, and the consolidation pressure was actually led to a couple of companies deciding to either sell their business or you know, stopping to be on the market altogether, right? So there was some things that we could see that were at least in part, where at least track and trace was in part responsible for that development.
A question, I guess, is on the mind on most of the commercial players out there. What are the costs around to adapt the track and trace, to implement the track and trace? I know this involves some hardware, it involves some software, eventually training of people, and maybe others. Please share.
Yes. So in terms of the upfront investment for track and trace, not really talking about the training and all of that, of course, the biggest chunk is the equipment of the manufacturing lines, right? Especially if your manufacturing line is an automated production line, the kind of retrofit effort or the new machines you have to put into place to do track and trace, this is a significant cost for the company. So if you're, for example, a nicotine pouch producer or a vape producer, this is of course something you have to plan ahead on, because it's going to be a significant investment. Of course, there's also the software part involved, which is our part, which is also, it has some cost, but it's more on the, you know, on the maintenance side, right? You have to operate it, you run it, you need to support it, you need to update it. So the challenge that companies like us have is that we are kind of, our job is to manage the complexity, right? Because you mentioned the complexity. Even if you look in Europe, we now have 29 ID issuers, so we have 9 systems that are issuing codes, and we have to connect to all of these systems, and we have to maintain the interfaces to them so that we have a digital connection. Even when you look outside of Europe, right, more and more countries are implementing or making track and trace mandatory. The GCC region is doing quite a lot. Many of the former, Eastern countries that are associated with the former Soviet Union, they implemented a system called CRPT, which is also track and trace. Some of these systems are harmonized, right? So, for example, when you have the production in Europe and you're sending to, let's say, the UAE, they have harmonized their systems. So these systems can speak with each other, but then you have systems, if you go, let's say you're dealing with Kazakhstan, just as an example, these systems are not harmonized, right? They don't speak with each other. And then you even have to implement systems like applying 2 codes on a pack instead of 1, right? Because by design, these systems cannot talk to each other, right? And then it gets even more complicated than that. So depending on how big your organization is, how many countries you serve, even outside of Europe, the complexity can increase even more.
How was the complexity for importers? Let's say they're not manufacturing, but they're importing from China, where I guess there's no connection between the systems.
Well, the challenge here is more that if you're an importer here, right, and you have manufacturing outside of Europe in China, for example, then there's of course the challenge that you have to make sure that your manufacturer knows that there is
exactly what it has to comply with. Yes.
Exactly. And then if it's an automated production they have, of course the system has to be implemented in China, right? And then of course they're usually very reluctant to buy equipment from Europe, right? So they're going to rely on Chinese suppliers, and then it's a challenge that we, for example, have, that we kind of educate the guys over there that provide the equipment how to implement it to be compliant with the regulation, right? So it's not just in the software part, it's also the expertise part that we provide to them, because the Chinese companies will never have the ability to follow that closely the European regulation that they will always know, right? So there always needs to be some kind of link, and this is what we're establishing.
Maybe a question for all of you. From your data, is there any data proven that the track and trace implementation decreased the black market, the illicit trade?
Honestly, I think in isolation, no. Right? It's always a more kind of differentiated picture that you have to draw in order to come up with that. But what we've seen in general, I think, is that, and probably Lorenzo can say even more about that, that in the countries where there's, for example, a very high tax rate, there's a much stronger incentive for illicit trade. And also then the track and trace has very little effort, right? And little success rate, let's say. And a good example is maybe France, right? So France is an example. And the customs in France, they don't even dare usually to publish the real numbers, right? You have probably more than 50%. I think it's pretty reliable to say more than 50% black market rate, right? So it's massive, right? So and of course, if the black market is larger than the legal market, there's a real issue, and it cannot be solved by regulation alone for sure. So there's something, and then they really would have to revisit the tax structure, and there's questions like, okay, I mean, if the product that I buy illegally has the branding and the one that's legal doesn't have a branding, I mean, does that create the right incentive for the consumer to buy the legal product? Right? There's stuff like that you have to ask yourself. And it seems that, at least in the case of France, the regulators are not really willing to have that honest discussion.
Anything to add?
Yeah, just on what Leonhard was saying, taxation here, like the level of taxation is the main issue, because the track and trace system is a high quality system from what I understand, at least what we have in Europe, that's what I know. And yeah, the problem in Europe with the free movement of goods and people, like people living in the border in France, they can just go to Spain or to Luxembourg or wherever the excise duty is lower and buy a 10 pack of combustibles, you know. So that's there the real issue, and that's where also the European Commission cannot really do anything, you know, because they cannot limit like how high a tax is going to be imposed on a given good, nicotine good, you know. That's the issue.
We ended at some same point. We need a harmonization, but the upcoming harmonization, it's not really fulfilling the need. This gets me to another question. So, Leonhard, do you think are we building systems that are adaptable or systems that are already becoming outdated?
But when it comes to track and trace, I think they need to be adaptable, right? And I think this is a challenge that lies on the economic operator, right? Regardless of what you do in the supply chain, whether you're a manufacturer, you're an importer, distributor. When you invest in those systems, you need to make sure that you look at it from a strategic point of view, because the requirements will very likely increase in the future. So it's very important that you invest in a solution that has that kind of promise, right? That the supplier of that system or software that you provide, that you procure, has that commitment to go with the times, right? And so it's usually not a good idea, in our opinion, to rely on small regional suppliers. It's usually not a good idea to rely on companies that don't have, let's say, a small number of customers where they wouldn't be able to develop their systems further when new requirements become necessary and stuff like that. So it's really a strategic objective, and we've seen that a lot. Just to give you one example, I've been right now talking to a company in Serbia, right? In Serbia is obviously it's outside of Europe, but they had shipments to Europe, right, which was maybe 10% of their volume. So naturally, what they often do is when they have to do the track and trace for the first time, they try to implement a solution that's as cheap as possible in order to have a quick fix for the regulatory part, right? And now in Serbia, this track and trace has been implemented last year, right? So the Serbian government decided it, and suddenly they have a solution that is only covering 10% of their volume. It could not be extended to cover the Serbian requirement, and they had to completely revamp their system and invest a second time, right? So this is a classical mistake many companies do, right? They look at it as a point solution, and then when it becomes a thing that they have to do for all of their business, then suddenly they realize that the system is not able to grow with the needs. And this is something that I think the industry now has the chance, right? They look at it from a strategic point of view and not from okay, we're not going to do anything unless we have to. They have to look at it with a long-term view and understand how they can implement systems that are able to grow as the requirements change.
I'd like to address a question to all of you. Where do you see the biggest gap today? Is the data collection, enforcement, or the cross-border coordination?
It's obviously a combination, right? But when I look at the track and trace part specifically, is where I have the most expertise. I see that there's huge differences in enforcement, right? And if there is enforcement, it's usually not coordinated across borders. So this is the biggest one I see. And we even see that it's very different from country to country which agencies or which authorities are even responsible. Right? If you look in Germany, for example, it's usually the health authorities. Right? So if you go to a customer and there's a customs there, they have no idea about track and trace. In Germany, right?
Usually the customs is the one in charge with the track and trace.
Yeah, exactly. And then you come to another country where the customs is the ones, right? And even though the European Union has done a few things, right? So for example, they have created a structure where competent authorities can request support, right? And they could be trained on the solution, they could request applications, they could use for the enforcement, where they could scan products and get quick results on whether the product was legal or not, or was illicitly traded. That effort has been quite limited, and also it seems that many of the authorities that would be entitled to participate in those programs didn't know about it or didn't take up the opportunity to do it. So there's on the enforcement side, it seems it's very, very limited, and even in some countries where there's quite a bit of enforcement. I'll give one example is Romania, for example. We see a lot of enforcement there. Lately in Denmark, historically also a lot in Sweden. That sometimes, so in Romania, it's my opinion, right? But it was more about generating revenue for the government rather than really improving the system as such and the compliance, right? So the enforcement has been patchy overall, and I think it would help a great deal if there would be a more coordinated effort and a more, effort to maybe also go after companies that are not part of the legal structure to begin with. Because if the only companies you are checking are the companies that are registered in the system, then you're only checking companies that are at least making an effort already to be compliant. Maybe they have a few gaps here and there, and they're not there yet fully. But that's the wrong approach, right? And you've seen, on the other hand, and most of you will have read that in the news, right? There's a illegal cigarette factory found out in Europe every couple of weeks, and there's a tremendous number of tobacco products produced illegally in Europe. And in that area, very little, it seems to me, very little is really done.
You were saying, you give an example of Romania, maybe border countries on the border of the EU. have more enforcement because at the end of the day that's the entry point for many cigarettes that arrive even up to the center of Europe, the west of Europe. Would you say that you see more enforcement in border countries or?
But in the olden days, I think there was a lot of production outside the borders of Europe and there was a lot of smuggling within Europe. I'm not sure that happens the same way that it did in the past. But there's still a lot of, I mean, and I do that when I'm traveling and I, for example, go to France and I'm offered I usually buy it. Just because, and of course I check if there's a code, right? And then when there's a code I buy it.
For research purpose, right?
For research purposes, obviously. And then I would go to my colleagues and ask them to check it and scan the code and see where it's from, right? And there's quite a lot of smuggling happens within the borders of Europe. So for example, lately, last time I was in Paris, I went to the flea market and I bought an illicit pack of Marlboros there. And I scanned it and it was actually duty-free Switzerland. So that was certainly not brought out in from outside of Europe. It was a legally produced pack as well, but somehow it ended up on the flea market in Paris.
So your conclusion is it's a combination of all, but mostly enforcement and lack of coordination between enforcement.
Yes, absolutely.
Tomasz, Lorenzo, anything to add?
So I would say that, answering to your question, that cross-border coordination is the biggest issue here, and as we as a companies, I think we can say that we are pushed to scale, to be big enough to be capable of dealing with the changes and making the cost of the changes not eat all the profit that we make. So if we have to do it as a companies, if it's a necessity to be big enough to be more resilient for the changes, then it means that we have to operate internationally, and it because of that we simply the biggest challenge is cross-border coordination.
So, hearing you, I guess the only solution, again, we're talking about harmonization, taxation, so on, but eventually the solution is the federalization, right? to have a unique European control body, and
I'm not sure if that would be a solution if we all agreed that the regulations and taxation should be completely complex and the scope of the differences should be big. And if we agree on that, then maybe you're right. But I think that from the company's perspective, the solution probably should be opposite. So to make the regulations and taxation as simple as possible, to make it reasonable for the companies to operate and not be on the current pressure of legal changes. And this is what we experienced actually from the very beginning of Chemnovatic. Maybe the first years were a bit less difficult, but last years, also including the changes that have been implemented inside Poland, not from the EU inspiration, let's say, it makes us operating on the current pressure, current need for adaptation, current costs for adapting to things. And sometimes I guess like this Serbian company, it might be a mistake maybe to choose a system that is not capable for introducing the solution for the whole business of that company, including selling in Serbia. But sometimes due to the unpredictable changes, we simply implement some kind of system, some kind of solution that turns out to be not enough due to the next changes that appear. So we have to double the cost or triple the cost sometimes because of this unpredictability of the changes. So I would rather say that we would really prefer not to have consistent and very demanding regulations across the whole Europe, but rather to have passively simple regulations with differences, but not the same European context.
So to wrap up the topic around illicit trade dynamics. So do you believe the illicit trade primarily driven by the tax differentiation, or the regulatory gaps and enforcement weakness?
Okay, so maybe I will add a word to the discussions that we had in a moment. We operate in Poland, and our border, our neighbors are Belarus and Ukraine, and quite big part of the illicit market is, in terms of cigarettes, is coming from these countries. So this is at least in the case of Poland, but I guess that also other countries that has a neighbors from outside of the EU, I guess it is a problem. But in terms of illicit market and the reason why that market is growing, again, the case of Poland I think is quite good, because we had excise tax introduced, I guess it was 2021. We had it already for about 4 or 5 years, and in the beginning the level of this tax was much lower than it is now, and when it was implemented, of course it had some influence on the prices of the retail products. The bigger influence that it had then on the prices, it was on the businesses, because of the excise tax guarantees that each company has to have. And in terms of Cannovatic, it is a couple of millions of euros that we have to secure for that tax, and that means simply frozen big amount of capital, and that was a barrier and the condition that many companies didn't manage to meet because of they were not big enough simply. And now it's even more difficult, because the level of this excise tax is much bigger. So I would say that this is something that is not very often discussed, that it is a really operational challenge for the companies, and this is an important thing. But from the perspective of illicit market, now the taxation, and most of it is from the excise tax of the liquids in Poland, it is about half of the price. So if the gap is so big, then the motivation for the customers to buy from the illegal sources is much bigger than if the difference were lower. And of course, it is also a motivation for the illegal manufacturers to take that risk and to manufacture illegally, because simply the profits might be much bigger than they would be if the tax were lower. And we can see it in Poland. The size of illicit market has grown significantly within last years, and it didn't grow so much in the beginning when the excise tax was introduced, but it grew with time when the level of this tax was growing with time.
So to sum it up, you believe it's a combination again of the value tax differential, regulatory gaps and enforcement weakness, but especially with a focus on the tax level.
Yes, of course. I wouldn't say that this is the only reason, but I think that in case of Poland, at least, it is the main reason.
Leonhard, do you believe that technology realistically can close this gap, or this is fundamentally it's a policy, it's a policy problem, policy issue?
Okay, the gap that we addressed today, I think technology alone cannot close it. I think that's a clear statement I can make. It can help to kind of create a more level playing field in certain areas, but it has to go hand in hand with the taxation that makes sense and doesn't create the wrong incentives. And it does need to go hand in hand with an enforcement that is coordinated between countries and targets mostly the companies that are really involved in the illicit trade of the product. Right? And it includes, of course, what you have been saying, Christoph, is that of course there's illicit products coming in from outside of Europe, but there's also a lot of illicit trade happening within Europe. And I mean, one example that I didn't give yet, that was a lot of focus in the past, was the trade, for example, that there was a lot of smuggling from Poland to UK, for example. I mean, so that happens as well. It probably still does. Maybe it's a little bit less because there's more enforcement now. But even like tax products, where in countries where the tax is lower, have been smuggled to countries where the tax is much higher. So there's even that kind of issue that existed for a long time. In UK is one of the examples, of course, where the tax is very high. France is another one. And that is also something that has existed. So both of these topics need to be addressed comprehensively and not just with technology.
Thank you. A question to all of you. So, one risk you see that policymakers are underestimating. What do you say? Are there risks that the policymakers are not looking enough at it? What?
Yeah, for me the main problem is not taking into consideration the nature of new products and therefore the less harmful, less tax. Definitely that's for me is the main risk, and yeah, also as my colleagues here they were saying before, high level of taxations as well create a big issue for the illicit market that it's basically almost impossible to control, but can be lowered if the tax system is adapted to the products we're talking about.
I think in general, every regulation, whether it be taxes or other kind of regulation, creates incentives, right? Negative or positive incentives. And if the regulators don't take that into account when they create these regulations, then they're not doing their job properly, right? And if you create an incentive, or if you think that you're solving a problem by raising taxes, and then you realize that the illicit market is exploding, then obviously there's something you didn't take into account, right? And then you have to think about, okay, how can I address that issue? And it seems often the regulators aren't able to really respond in a good way when they see that the regulation is not going the intended way. To reverse course, it seems to be very difficult, and oftentimes they're not able to do that. We've seen it, by the way, one time in Germany that they were able to do that, but it was only I have one example. But it was only after the tax collected went down extremely, and that was they implemented for the shisha tobacco. They invented a rule to allow only 25 grams, right? Because they thought it was easier to control the shisha shops and the shisha bars, because then they would have to buy portions, and it would be very much easier for the regulators to understand how much they buy and how much they sell. To calculate the taxes and the volumes and so on, and when they realized that it didn't have the intended outcome, and they were still buying illicitly traded product, and the 25 grams really didn't make any difference, and had the opposite effect, right? They were actually buying less of the real product, because the cost per serving went up so much because the packagings were much smaller and the production cost per item became much higher. They actually did reverse the regulation and allowed again to produce bigger packages. So that's one example where they did reverse course, but in many instances they do not.
So I think my colleagues have said quite a lot about that. In two words, maybe I would say that the transition costs, and that means in terms of economics, there are some, and in general, unintended results of the implementation of the regulations. So the impact on economics, impact the companies outsourcing their part of their businesses from the countries in which the regulations are implemented, as well as unintended results or effects on public health. And while the taxation is implemented in some way, it should of course be designed in a way to influence the behavior of the customers in a positive way. It turns out that it's not always works like that in different countries. Of course, in some it works properly, but in some not. So not to repeat my colleagues, unintended changes that or effects that take place after implementing these regulations.
Thank you. So, my last question before we'll take some questions from the public. What is that one thing that the industry should do better, in your opinion? Pick one.
One thing that
the industry should do better. should do if it's not doing it?
So I would say two things. First thing is to prepare or try to prepare better for the changes, upcoming changes, and try to let's say develop some scenarios or describe some scenarios of possible scenarios that may happen. And for example, in terms of implementing the specific laws in different countries, when we can see that there were some specific regulations on the flavors in one country, and it turns out that there is some risk that we can only manufacture tobacco flavors, maybe then we should at least develop a recipe for tobacco lipids or other forms of NGP products. So thinking forward and trying to prepare for the possible changes and having some possible scenarios to act when the changes seem to be implemented. So this is the one thing.
So your message is look at the possible outcome and prepare for all of them.
Yes, so observe the trends, observe the changes that are being implemented in the countries, and be prepared that these changes might be implemented in the countries that the company operates as well. And the second thing, I would say that probably maybe we could be more effective in dialogue with regulators as an industry to have a bigger impact on the way that the regulations are being implemented. And of course, it's easier to say than do, because we are not always listened, of course. But if there for sure is a space for improvement, and at least I think we all would like to be listened more, and probably there are some ways to have a better influence on the way the changes are implemented, and our voice possibly could be heard more by the regulators.
I think one thing the industry can do for sure is make sure that they're not repeating the mistake the industry has done in the past, right? And this is something I think everybody needs to be aware of. So in the past, of course, they made mistakes by, for example, advertising to the wrong target groups, such as doing advertising that could be perceived as advertising to minors, even if it's just perception, not intentional. They could do things like voluntarily agree to not have nicotine levels that are so high that it could be, that there could be things like happening that youth that are experimenting with it have serious health consequences, because that would create a public relations backlash to the industry. And those things have happened in similar ways, not the same way, but in similar ways with the traditional tobacco industry in the past, right? And they've learned from it and moved away from it. And I think the novel products, they should be aware and look at what has happened in the past and not repeat the same mistakes. So that would be, I'm sure, something that could be beneficial for the industry.
So learn from other mistakes.
Yes, exactly.
Comply with the actual regulation and be responsible even above the actual regulation, exactly. Because we know we have a lot of gaps.
And of course, most of them do, right? But there's always it seems that in the industry there's always like someone, because it's a big industries and not everybody is talking with each other, that believe that by doing something differently than everybody else they may have a benefit from it, but that can harm the whole industry if it's done wrongly.
Yeah, my opinion is I think like Tomasz, I think engagement is the most important thing at this moment, especially at the European level. So even though I know it's difficult for industry stakeholders to actually engage and be listened by the authority, I think that maybe also a coordinated effort can change things, bringing scientific evidences. It's been shown that regulators can change their mind, because in my opinion, most of the time this regulation that we believe is not really correct for the products we are talking about is because regulators most of the time are ignorant about the products, So for me, there should be also part of education. I know it's difficult. I know there are limitations, of course, for the lobbying, but I think that should be especially at the European Union level, because for example, just the member of the parliament, I'm sure that 80% of them, they don't even know maybe what a pouch is or how they work, how they actually you use them, you know. So yeah, I think it's this should be education, and yeah, more engagement being more crucial in that sense.
From where I stand, I can tell you that first of all, I don't think ever anybody refuses a meeting with a stakeholder. Maybe the other way, it's happening often. And yes, I agree. The education, that's a big lack of education. People in key positions regulating from the health perspective, or they still don't make a difference between a heat-not-burn, a vaping base, and I don't know, something else. So yeah, thank you all. Thank you very much. Any questions from the public?
Thank you very much. Jesus Olivares with Imperial Brands. I want to come back to the point of illicit trade. So the European Commission has just published an evaluation report looking at how TPD2 has worked in the last 2 decades, in the last decade. There is almost no discussion there as regards illicit trade. There is almost no discussion on the effectiveness of the track and trace system that was set out to address the problem of illicit trade. Now we are seeing that the narrative of the European Commission around illicit trade has changed. They no longer see the system as a tool to reduce illicit trade, but rather as a tool to track data, to collect data in regards to the legal supply chain. What I found most paradoxical was that the European Commission seems to be of the opinion that illicit trade is in decline in Europe, and when they look at that, they are of the opinion that track and trace, while it is a system now to look at the legal supply chain, it seems that it is actually contributing to this decrease in illicit trade. They don't expand actually how track and trace reduces illicit trade. So I wanted to ask, how do you think track and trace, a system that tracks the legal supply chain, is actually reducing illegal supply of illicit industry? Yeah.
I guess that's for me.
I was looking at you. Yeah.
Well, I think you heard me saying that I don't think track and trace in isolation does reduce illicit trade. So that's my personal opinion at the end of the day, right? As somebody who's been involved in track and trace for a very long time. So I agree with you with the statement you made, and I would tend not to agree with the assessment of the European Union here. And it seems to be a little bit of a cop out, right? Kind of changing the narrative after the fact. And yeah, so this is probably something that needs to be addressed also with the regulators to see, okay, what was the original idea when implementing track and trace, and how can we make sure that the original idea has still some consequence today. And as I said, I mean, track and trace itself, of course, it provides valuable information of the supply chain and many things, and I'm sure there's a benefit to that, even for the regulators, even if it's not the original idea of the whole story. But it has to come alongside an enforcement of illegal ways of the tobacco supply, both production and distribution. And if that's not what's happening, and understanding the incentive that the overall system creates today of even increased illicit trade, and I would even say, and you probably agree with me when you dealing with the subject, that in certain areas, for sure, in certain regions, the illicit trade has actually increased and not decreased. And the reason we know that is because we can actually use the data that we have, not necessarily from the track and trace system, but other ways that we can gather data and see what people are smoking, even going to like to sites. I think there's ways for them to do. They go to waste sites and collecting the packets, and then do some extrapolation and then come up with the data of how much is consumed not legally. Yeah. So it's a clear statement. Track and trace, I think, is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not solving the issue of illicit trade without other measures.
Yeah, because maybe if I can react to that. Sure, now there is more data. There is a good collection of data on the legal supply chain, but can you tell me of what is the specific way in which this collection of data is having a dent on illicit trade? Because the Commission does not expand on that. They make this statement: we have data, and we think track and trace is decreasing illicit trade. But they don't specify how. So as you're the expert, how does the collection of the data, how is it impacting on a decrease on illicit trade? Because I don't see any association whatsoever.
I think it's a very it's probably not easy to just answer this question. It's more a longer discussion that you could have, and you need a lot of evidence from other areas to provide a holistic picture on this, right? I mean, the first question is, okay, how do we know how much illicit trade exists, right? Do we have reliable information? And what is creating illicit trade, and what is creating the incentives? I would also say that just the fact that track and trace exists is not creating the incentive in itself, right? And what it probably does, right? And this is maybe one argument in favor of track and trace, is that you know, it's not necessarily black and white, the industry, right? And you know this from the past, also from the big tobacco producers. They have been fined in the past also because they have knowingly provided products into the grey or illicit markets, right? And this is something, of course, track and trace addressed or has addressed, and I believe that with regards to, you know, keeping the big companies responsible, and you know, to give you an example, I have a very recent development. So Gibraltar is implementing track and trace, right? Gibraltar has been known for years to be a channel where huge volumes were illicitly bought and then, you know, consumed elsewhere, right? In the past, the big tobacco companies have delivered a lot of product to Gibraltar, and then at some point there were controversies about it. There have been, I suppose, fines about it, so they moved out of that market, right? So by making it the data available on it, and there was even a basis for the regulators to say, oh, look, what's happening there is related to illicit trade. So the data that was collected from track and trace system did help, or did kind of force the companies to be more responsible with who they sell their products to, for example, right? So there's a couple of arguments that you can make in favor of that, but it still does not address, and I agree with you, somebody who's not even intending to be legal, right? So that part of the market is not addressed.
Any other questions?